we're now going to talk to Lisa. And Lisa is someone who has for a long time been involved in conflict resolution. She comes from a university in Bradford, which has got a very, very prestigious reputation in peace studies. And so they're involved a great deal in how do you create the conditions where people can resolve conflict through dialogue rather than through violence. And in fact, they have a Twitter page, and I've just put this up now. So again, if you look on the right, you can visit their Twitter page. You've got the link there, and you've got the @ sign, so you can go directly to the page if you want. And if you want to tweet to that page during this webinar or at any other time, please feel free to do that, because I know Lisa would be very, very pleased if you did. So I'll keep that up just until Lisa starts. Anyhow, Lisa, thanks for doing this. I hope we sorted out your sound problem. If we do have sound problems, everyone, I apologize, and we'll try and see what we can do if it is a bit rough. But if it's not too rough, we'll go ahead. So Lisa, thank you for doing this and taking us through peaceful resolution of conflict in cities in the way that you've done it, and particularly in Bradford. So over to you.
Thank you, Francis, and good evening, everybody. Thank you to Francis and GlobalNet 21 for inviting me to come and share a story. What I'm hoping to do is to share a story of a network, a story of lots of people coming together to try and work stuff out. So yes, I work for PPC PeaceHub, which is, yes, you'll be able to see on the first slide. I'm based at the University of Bradford, rooted in peace studies, and part of our aim is to facilitate conversations and connections about peacemaking in Bradford and beyond. And I think that begs the first question, which is, what do I mean when I say peacemaking? And I'd like to share with you a quote on the next slide, if I may. It's a quote by Adam Curl, who was the person who founded Peace Studies with the support of Quakers. He was the first professor of Peace Studies in Bradford. And he said something that I have found to be something that's simple but also rich, and something that I turn back towards. And he said that there were two tasks of being a peacemaker. The first task is to transform unpeaceful relations into peaceful relations. And the second task is to work for conditions conducive to peace and unfavourable to violence. So relations and conditions are two elements of peacemaking that I try to balance in the work that I do. And so what I'd like to do on the next slide, you'll be able to see, I'd like to tell you some stories and give you some examples about relations and the relations side of our work to start with. And you can see here there's a spider web. Those of you that are familiar with John Paul Lederach will know of his idea about the web of relationships. The idea that John Paul Lederach would speak about people who have the moral imagination to be able to imagine ourselves in a web of relations. And I'd like to share some examples about the webs and networks that we've tried to create, very much in partnership with others. So to start with, the next slide is one of the things that we've done, and we did a lot of early on, is to have public conversations about issues that really matter to people. We used to have a very big lecture series called God and Caesar, looking at religion and secularism. We've moved away from some of the big public conversations, and I'll say a little bit more about that towards the end, but we still do have public conversations where people come and explore things and think together. And two recent examples, or examples from last year. One would be, we had the reasonably new Bishop of Bradford at the time, Bishop Toby Howarth, together with Sheikh Fuad Nadi, and they were actually coming to speak about austerity and how faith should respond to austerity. But instead, because of the events in Paris, the attacks on the Charlie Hebdo offices, they converted the talk that they were giving to be instead a conversation about faith and creativity, about imagination, creativity, about some of the tensions between faith and freedom of speech. So they converted their talk to meet a current need. And also, I worked with Initiatives for Change, who very kindly brought a really fantastic film about the reconciliation process in South Africa, and we explored forgiveness, the whole idea of forgiveness. And it was a big public conversation in a lecture theatre, but we also managed to bring in a little bit of space for people to reflect in a slightly more creative way, as you can see on the photo on the slide. So we do have public conversations. We tend to have public conversations where we work in partnership with other organisations. And another example would be, we will be having a conversation on the 8th of June on the EU referendum, and that's in partnership with Bradford Trades Council, and it's looking at the EU referendum from in or out in relation to people who are interested in trade unionism, social justice, climate change, human rights. So we do have big public conversations still, but less so. And then the next slide just shows a photograph from something that we had the real privilege of being involved in for a number of years, until funding unfortunately got the better of the event this year. And this is something called the Big Sing for Peace, where hundreds and hundreds of school children in Bradford from diverse parts of the district would come together and open Bradford Festival. And this was something that we tried to work with partners to really make sure that we were connecting all of the various agencies and organisations working for peace in Bradford, to celebrate that there are lots of people in Bradford who are working at peaceful relations. And this was a partnership event. Lots of people were much more heavily involved in organising the practicalities than me, but it was something that we were able to support and get involved with and be a bit of a catalyst for in the early days. So an example of perhaps a reasonably traditional event in terms of creating space for people to come together and to celebrate, and there would be a community aspect after the children had participated as well. So I wanted to focus with the next set of images on some of the quieter work that we do. So we facilitate something called the Relations Think Space. And that's a network of people who come together to share ideas and dilemmas and explore questions in relation to conflict, good relations work, dialogue. So who are we? How do we live together? What happens when we disagree? Lots of people who are either doing research into those areas, or who are very practically working with communities, practitioners working with communities who come together, who want to have space to think, who need some space to think through the complexity of what's happening in relation to how we're getting on or not. And I think one of the things that I think is really important about the Think Space is to make space for nuance. So it's beyond debate, it's space where people can be befuddled and explore and be confused and not know. And very often practitioners who are working with the complexity of conflict really need their own space to think. So just some very brief examples from the images you can see there. We have the top left-hand side, we have the Kumi gathering. So a couple of years ago, we were very, very privileged to have a European network of peacemakers who use a process called Kumi, developed in Israel-Palestine, who had their European network gathering in Bradford, and we were able to bring the relations think-space people together with the European network, and we had a really, really rich conversation. You can also see some plates that have labels on, and they come from a workshop we did on the tricky issue of child sexual exploitation. And the work that we did around that, we had a dialogue space where we came together and talked, and practitioners in particular who were working in communities on the issue of child sexual exploitation. How do we talk about it? What can we say? What can't we say? How do we create space to open up the discussion, but in a way that doesn't make things worse? And what are the practitioners' own relationship to such a controversial issue? So we had a dialogue, first of all, where people just talked very personally about how the issue was impacting on them. And then artists listened to that, and some fantastic artists, Uzma Kazi and Jean McEwen, came up with a creative process for a wider group of people to explore the issue further. And some of those ideas and ways of working led to people then using some of those methods in community conversations in other places. And the bottom example, you'll see the Charlie Hebdo example. That photograph represents a time when we felt, or I was asked to respond to a particular moment. So after the Charlie Hebdo events in Paris and the attacks on the kosher supermarket, the attacks on Charlie Hebdo, the attacks on the kosher supermarket, people wanted space to reflect on what had happened. And one of the really interesting things that I noticed is that people with the most diverse networks, it relates a little bit to what Francis was speaking about earlier, people with the most diverse social media networks were the people who were experiencing very strong disagreement. People perhaps thought that there would be some shared values around freedom of speech, around artistic expression, or around religious offence. And when they realised that actually there was quite deep value-based disagreement within a network of allies, they struggled. And so people who were arguing on social media were tagging me in saying, actually, can we come face to face and talk about it? So we had a responsive think space, which we've done a couple of times, to make space to speak through a tricky issue of conflict that's live and affecting people in the moment. And I guess one other example I wanted to share just before I go on to this practical peacemaking intervention is we've also done some work recently on security and identity with the Amadan group, and I'll say a little bit more about that afterwards. But the Amadan group are a group of people who, NGOs and peacemakers, a fantastic group of people who want a public conversation about security and identity. And our last think space explored that the Amadan group are wanting a conversation about rethinking security, and an element of that is security and identity. And so our last think space looked at security and identity, and that's something I'll mention a little bit more about. So yes, thank you. The next slide, the practical peacemaking interventions. So this is something where we have we felt that we were in a position perhaps to make a very small contribution amidst lots of obviously statutory and other contributions to peacemaking and to keeping things peaceful when there's been the threat of potential unrest. So it started in 2010 when the English Defence League said they were going to hold a very big demonstration in Bradford, and many people in Bradford had concerns because of memories of the 2001 riots. So we managed to pull together a peace network, and we've done so in 2010, 2012, 2013, 2015 at times of EDL protest, and I could talk a lot about that. So just to flag up just a few key things. So as I say, our contribution is a small, very tiny contribution amidst many, many other people doing all sorts of incredible things. So yes, all sorts of people, obviously, working at the statutory level, police and council, and lots of great civil society peacemakers, such as Bradford Women for Peace. What our contribution has been, first of all, has been conflict analysis. So we have not done any peacemaking intervention without undergoing a full conflict analysis of the trends. So if we could just go back to the EDL protest, because this takes us onto another issue here. So just going back to the practical peacemaking intervention slide for now. Thank you. So we've undertaken conflict analysis. We have also negotiated and got agreement for a team of street mediators. And we've certainly learned a lot from friends and contacts in Northern Ireland, and also people who've worked with organisations like Mediation Northern Ireland, including the Centre for Good Relations, as was in Burnley. So street mediators, we've also utilised some deep connections we have with young men in particular who have street influence, who know exactly what to do to prevent violence, and we've worked with them in a really interesting way. And on the day of EDL protest, those people with deep connections are the ones that make a huge difference. And some of that work with people with deep connections with street influence has been shaped and formed through some really excellent research that Professor Jenny Pearce and Dr. Janet Budry did into the riots in 2001. We've also had a conduit role, so we've been able to connect civil society peacemaking people, a peacemaking network with the local state, with the council and police. So we've been able to play a bridging role. And we've utilised our relationships and networks that we've fostered in dialogue work. So people involved in the think spaces become part of the peace network and so on. And the really lovely thing about the practical peacemaking interventions as well is the case studies of what we've done, how we've worked, that's all shared with Peace Studies MA students on applied conflict resolution skills, and also on other courses. So we're learning by doing, and then sharing that learning with our students. And I could say more about that, but I best stop there. So going back to the beginning, Adam Curl spoke about relations, and I've given you hopefully some examples of the work that we do in terms of relations, but he also spoke about conditions. So the second task being, how do we work for conditions that are favourable to peace and unfavourable to violence? So to only focus on relations would be missing the context, the structural violence. It would be missing out on what we need to do in terms of conditions. So I'd like to share some examples of the work that we're doing in terms of conditions. So the next slide shows some images from another think space. So we have the relations think space and we have the community think space. Community is a coming together of community and university. You can see what we did there. And this is a think space that's very much about bringing activists and scholars together and practitioners to share thinking about power, resistance and change. And it comes from two research council projects. and it's the work that we've done. You can see the top left-hand corner. We've had pop-up seminars in empty shops in Bradford. Again, you can see the right-hand photo, that comes from some zine making that we did with artists. So again, trying to be creative in the way we explore issues. And in terms of the kind of conversations we've had, we've looked at democracy. We've very recently just been looking at activism and the kind of connections that activists need. What kind of relationships and connections do activists need? We're going to be having a young artist do a creative workshop for us very soon on fear and activism, fear and social change. And I think one of the things that's really important to say about the community think space is we as for the relations think space, themes are agreed collectively. It's not us as a university saying what it is that we think people should be speaking about. The themes are absolutely agreed, and participation is equal. So scholars aren't coming along to give their knowledge. It's absolutely knowledge exchange. It's a place where people can explore together. So there's no hierarchy in terms of transmitting knowledge. And I think also what's important is the way we come together. So when we meet, we bring food to share, and there's a real sense of community when we come together. So it's a small network, it's a very diverse network, but I think one of the things that I would say lies at the heart of it is trust. So another example of some work that we've done on conditions is with some really fantastic colleagues. I've been lucky enough to contribute towards becoming a University of Sanctuary. Our aim is to become a University of Sanctuary, and to make sure that our university is a place of that's welcoming for people that are fleeing war and persecution. And obviously, particularly having a peace studies division, that's absolutely fundamental. So a small group of us have worked together. The University of Sanctuary Working Group is something that has really been led by a fantastic academic midwife called Mel Cooper, and she's done some brilliant work in the School of Health Studies. And one of the things that we'll be doing is joining other universities in offering Article 26 bursaries, where asylum seekers and refugees will be able to have fees waived for in terms of coming to study at the university. And the next slide just shows a recent event that we held at the University at the university as part of the Diversity Festival week, and it shows a whole range of people on the left coming together and joining together to really celebrate the achievement so far, and also to make sure that people hold the university to account in terms of working at becoming a University of Sanctuary. And it was an event where there were lots of refugees and refugee families who came along. The panel was very, very diverse. And it was an absolute pleasure as well. It's not so clear to see, but there's a photograph on the right, and we were very lucky to have a Syrian refugee, a doctor and a poet called Bashar Farhat, who brought his amazing exhibition to the university, which is a whole piece of creative work that's taken place in refugee camps. So again, we weren't talking about refugees. This was an event that was very much organised and planned with refugees, and we hope that we will become a University of Sanctuary soon. So just another example of our work around conditions would be, I've worked with Rachel Julian at Leeds Beckett University and Quaker Robin Bowles to establish West Yorkshire Non-Violence Network, which again is another network, another space for people to share ideas about non-violence and about civil resistance. Some of the events that we've had, we had an event in Huddersfield that Robin organised, which was looking at Syria, and it was just an incredible and really emotional event because of the Syrian voices that were there in terms of what on earth could help. An event that we organised with Ali Gohar was an event on Abdul Ghaffar Khan, sometimes known as the Frontier Gandhi, but is an incredible Muslim non-violent activist from the Peshawar region. And if you haven't heard of Bashar Khan, then do look him up. And we had a great seminar on Bashar Khan. And we also we will be in the next couple of weeks, on the 9th of June, we'll be having an event where we share some reflections from hanging out with the International Centre for Nonviolent Conflict. So Rachel Julian organised the International Centre to come over and to share their inspiration around nonviolence and civil resistance. And a few of us who attended will be saying what interested us, what surprised, what challenged us, and facilitating some conversation about that. So an important focus, I think. I think non-violence is something that is really worth giving some time to. So this is a new network. So past and future. I just very briefly wanted to just say a little bit about our shift in focus. So the next slide.
Hi, Lisa. Can we sum up soon so that we've got time for people to ask questions?
Of course.
Otherwise, yes. They won't have a chance to come in.
Absolutely. I'll be really quick.
Right, thanks.
So the next slide, just moving on from past and future, if we may, is just to share with you the next image in terms of a shift in our focus. So one of the things that I felt is that there was a lot of debate in our early days, and I felt we needed to develop our capacity to facilitate listening conversations, and that's something that caused a shift in our focus. And also there was a big shift because of the context and the impact of the July 7th London bombings, and there isn't time to go into that. But trust felt very fragile at that time, and that led to a shift away from the big public conversations to quieter work. So yeah, just to move on very swiftly, one of the big questions for me in terms of what's next is about universities and the nature of universities. Universities increasingly are there about business and money and numbers, and so where does that leave ethical long-term public engagement work? I think there's a big question mark about that at the minute. And also just the last slide I wanted to share is, I think some of the professors at Peace Studies, like Paul Rogers, would say that we're living in very unique times. We're living in times where there's a set of converging crises. We're living where, NASA reported recently that the 2 degrees temperature rise has already, that red line has already been reached. So if we are living in these times where everything has to change, what does that mean? And what does that mean for relations? What does that mean for conditions? So for me, the context of our times really, really matters in terms of peacemaking, in terms of conflict, and there's lots of things that are sitting in tension. But I do know that trying to keep a balance of relations and conditions is worth doing and worth clinging on to hope. Thanks, Francis.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Lisa. That was great. Sorry to rush you at the end, but we were moving fast into close to the last 20 minutes, and I wanted a chance for anybody who to ask questions. Michelle is the first person to ask a question here, and she says, as trust lies at the heart of a think space, how do you promote such trust amongst troubled parties? When you've got people who feel antagonistic, how do you engage them on the basis of trust?
Well, I think that there's a long answer to that. I'm mindful that tomorrow I'll be facilitating two parties, actually one set of two parties in a restorative justice process. So I am a restorative justice practitioner. I'm a volunteer with a very wonderful restorative justice hub in Bradford. And I guess within restorative justice, one of the things that you were doing is trying to support people having the conversation that they need to have, and that's about ensuring that there is some really deep listening. It's about ensuring that people are really, really prepared to think through what it is they want to say and how they're going to manage to hear the things that are difficult. So restorative justice, I think preparation before you come together in conversation is really important. I think in community conversations, what's really, really important is thinking through purpose and process. And I say that so much, I think I'm a broken record about it. But when you're thinking of having some sort of conversation where there is conflict, where there is tension, it's thinking through, well, what's the purpose of this conversation? What's needed here? And that's about listening to people before you even think about having a conversation about what the issues are, and thinking through what might the challenges be in terms of listening. So I just last night actually changed the focus of the think space when I heard how people were feeling about anti-Semitism. So it's about not rushing, it's about not just doing to people, it's about a careful approach, it's about really listening and really understanding what's needed, and then through that thinking of why might we have this conversation. It's then having the right process that allows that conversation to happen. And I'd say that there doesn't, in terms of people coming together, there doesn't have to be trust when there is conflict. That's something that isn't a prerequisite for people to come together. But I think that there is real value to networks of people that meet over time and can develop trust enough to get to some of the really difficult issues. And I certainly know through work that fellow dialogue practitioners have done. So somebody like Tariq Bashir, who works for Who Is Your Neighbour, would take a very, very slow approach to making sure that there was real sensitivity to encouraging people to be able to have the conversations they need, and would it might be, for example, working on a project where people are sitting in dialogue for years. So it's really about what's needed, what's the purpose and what's the right process. But you don't need to start with trust. Trust can be built.
And Karen asked, when you make these think spaces, who do you decide who's going to be involved? Do you have decision makers, counsellors, officers, or does that defeat the purpose? Because really what you're trying to do is get communities together. So what is the sort of basis for who you contact and who you engage?
So in terms of the think spaces, the relations think space is a mixture of people, and it's people who are interested. Not everybody wants to come together and to reflect and explore and to think about conflict, and not everybody is comfortable with dialogue as a process. So it attracts people that do want to think, that want to explore. We certainly do have council officers who come along, but they don't come as council officers, they come as themselves. They come as people who aren't representative of an institution, and that's partly the point for them, is that they're able to be able to explore without the burden of office in the spaces. So it's a mixture of people. It's communicated through social media and word of mouth, and people come along if they're interested in particular themes. When we've had responses, that's been responsive think spaces where, for example, the Charlie Hebdo think space, people have often said, I know somebody that really needs to talk about this, can they come? And of course it's, yeah, they have been open spaces. They're small networks, but yeah, they're not closed spaces. So they're open to people who want the kind of thing that we're offering.
Well, I mean, please, you know, fill in your questions. If you have any comments as well, put them down, but, you know, just type them in. It'd be great to have them. While we're waiting for the next one, let me ask you, Lisa, I mean, when you're dealing with groups and you get them together, one of the big problems I've found, and I'm sure you found it as well, is that when you engage, you're engaging the sort of organisers, the usual suspects, the people who are there all the time, and you're not going beyond them. Now, what efforts do you make when you're trying to engage people in conversation? How do you get the people who don't normally come to those organisations, who wouldn't normally come to those meetings? Are you always preaching to the converted, or can you find ways of going beyond that?
So I think there is a question there about connecting with people in communities. I've been quite clear that our role is you're talking about one person in terms of me, and with limited expertise, and so what we've concentrated on is to create spaces for people who have the expertise in doing exactly what you're saying. So, for example, in the case of the child sexual exploitation think space, we had a council officer, and we had people who, some incredible women who facilitate community networks in a part of Bradford, who were very strongly involved in the think space, but they were the ones going out and doing the engagement and knowing how to do that, and knowing how to bring people in conversations in community centres, and how to bring people into conversations through standing in shopping centres and listening to people in those sorts of places. So actually I'm quite clear that our role isn't community development. That's not what we're there for. We're there partly to be able to share ideas with people who are doing the doing and who have the expertise in working with communities. My background is in the voluntary sector, and in terms of the Peace Network work that I've done, I have got some experience in connecting with people, and I've never found people that hard to reach. If you go out and hang out in places where people are and you listen, I think that it's often quite easy to get to the right people if you go about it in the right way, and that's about listening and not doing to people, it's doing with people.
We did some seminars a little while ago, and there was a really interesting older gentleman there who does similar work to you in Leicester, and he did it through bringing faiths together, but he argued that most interfaith groups don't include those who don't believe anything. We know in The Guardian today that the biggest group in this country, growing group, is the nuns, the people who have no religion at all. And he was very concerned that they're left out. You just bring the faiths together and you're leaving out half the population. So do you do anything to include everyone in that sense, and look at people who don't have faith as well and bring them and make them involved?
Absolutely. I think that I've been involved in facilitating dialogue for many years, which that's much more community-based work. I worked with an organisation called the Intercultural Leadership and Communication School, and when it was facilitated a number of years ago, it absolutely brought people together of faith and no faith. I personally am not religious, and one of the things that I've found really personally wonderful, I suppose, is to work with Christians, to work with Muslims in particular, and to facilitate dialogue about the complexity of identity, about values and value-based disagreement, and to explore that in a really comprehensive way. I guess one of the things in dialogue that you would often try to do is not bring people together just in their boxes. You're partly trying to create a space where people can really explore the complexity of who they are, and once you get people in dialogue, things that seem straightforward are often so much more complicated and nuanced in a really beautiful way. So absolutely, I think one of the challenges that we've got in the UK is lots of funding for dialogue work tends to be in relation to interfaith work, which I think is absolutely vitally important. But I would agree, if it's missing out whole swathes of people, then I think it's not going to answer the question of how we live together with difference, and how we live together with difference in part is through how we listen, how we understand each other, and absolutely that has to be religious and secular values coming together.
Yeah. Michael Fryer asked this interesting question, which is always tricky, and always makes you think. He said, what are the mistakes you've made that you've really learnt from?
Well, hello to Michael. Michael is an old friend who I think has tuned in from San Diego, and would also be another great person to speak about peacemaking. So many mistakes. I mean, I think in the early days of Programme for a Peaceful City, I think there was a tendency to have big conversations about the exciting issues without thinking about process and without thinking about the quality of listening. And I'd hope there's been a shift towards thinking more about purpose, process, and the real importance of listening. If you facilitate a debate where people are just really enjoying saying what they're saying and nobody's listening to each other, then I think the value is limited. I really like debates. I really like an argument. So it always interests me. I have to really work at dialogue myself, but I can really see the value when actually you can sit together with difference. You can find a way of not agreeing, but understanding why somebody thinks and feels as they do. So I think certainly there was a mistake in not thinking enough about process in the early days. And I think I made a mistake very recently in terms of jumping too quickly to convene a think space about a really sensitive issue without slowing down, which is the advice I would always give to other people. And I think I didn't get the framing right. So how you frame a conversation really matters. And I've listened to people and reframed a conversation we're about to have. So many mistakes, and yes, and I think the more you facilitate dialogue, the more you work with conflict, the more questions you have, not answers.
Okay, well, thanks for that question, Michael. And if you're doing peace work in America, you know, it'd be very interesting if you wanted to do a webinar, or your colleagues over there wanted to do a webinar with us, to tell us how you, in your culture, in your set of circumstances, confront this issue of non-confrontation, if I can put it that way. So yeah, if you'd like to contact us, we'd be very happy to talk to you about, you know, following this up in that way. Michelle says, in sharing the value of dialogue and listening carefully, has this information been shared in schools? She thanks you for her previous answer too, but she's interested, do you also move into schools?
So I have connected with educationalists. I've had the privilege of working with an amazing woman called Lisa who facilitates Model United Nations debates, and I used to get to go and hang out at those, where I just was astounded to see what young people were capable of. Incredible kind of high level conversations work. And yes, I have worked with some educationalists and some teachers around dialogue work. I've also been in some spaces where teachers have explored how they feel about prevent and the prevent agenda. And sometimes we've been able to respond to an issue that perhaps teachers are wanting to understand. So there was a real issue in the year where there was the violence in Gaza, and teachers asked for us to have an academic respond to share some insights about contemporary issues, and that involved space for teachers to talk through how contemporary issues were impacting on their schools. But I'm always really mindful of what I'm not, and I'm not a teacher, and I think teachers are under the most incredible pressure at the minute, and I take off all my hats to them, and I think it's really challenging times. I think it would be fantastic to have more dialogue, to have more philosophy, and for teachers to feel that they could be as creative as they would like to be in schools. But there are some incredible people that I've worked with. The Peace Museum in Bradford, which is the only museum of its kind in the UK, they do some brilliant work. There's a Choices project that was developed by Diane Hadwin and is now being run by a woman called Jude Wright, and so there are organisations that do incredible work, and I'll connect with them and support, but very much on the basis that I'm not a teacher and don't have that expertise.
Lakshmi says she works in meditation, and they're very much involved in conflict resolution, but they work from the basis of deciding what the resolution should be first and work that way. Is that the method you use, or do you have a particular methodology of your own?
So, I mean, there are various forms of mediation, certainly, and I trained in mediation many years ago. I left mediation to one side when I felt that the context of Bradford lent itself to work around value-based disagreement, and I became very interested in dialogue facilitation. So my practice for a long time became dialogue facilitation. And it's more recently that I've come back to looking at how to support people get the resolution that they want in a more structured way, I guess. In dialogue, you don't have to resolve anything. And so it's more recently that I've come back to restorative justice and learn restorative justice, restorative practice as an approach, and I've been working on restorative practice, which is about looking at often it's about bringing together somebody who's been harmed with someone who has done the harming, and there's a very structured process whereby the parties would agree what they want to see happen. For me, mediation or restorative justice is about creating the space for people to come up with their own solutions. You're holding the space. You're not coming up with the solutions. That's my understanding of most alternative dispute processes.
Okay, and one thing I've definitely learned today is that I do need a new pair of glasses, because I said meditation and not mediation. So you could have answered the wrong question because I put it, but I'm glad you picked that up. Okay, well, we're coming close to the end, so let me ask you one final question. Do you have any means by which you can measure the social impact of what you do?
So now my head will just fall on the floor.
Very quickly.
Yeah. I think impact is a really big question. So yes, I have reports where I have qualitative responses from people where they say the impact of the spaces that we facilitate on them and on their lives. I think that so I can certainly evidence qualitative impact in relation to how people themselves would describe benefits. But I think that the problem is that it's very hard to measure trust. It's very hard to measure the impact of friendship. It's hard to measure what hasn't happened as opposed to what has happened. And it's something, there's a fantastic organisation called Talk for a Change who brought together a whole range of people to look at should there be a coalition of good relations in the UK? And one of the questions and one of the issues that everybody who works in good relations said that they need help with is this question of measuring impact. But of course, when we talk about impact, when we talk about measurement, that also tells us something about what we're valuing, and it's worth unpacking and thinking about.
Okay, well, thanks for that answer. I mean, we have the same problem. When you work in networks, it is incredibly difficult to measure social impact, because the culmination of the unintended good consequences is often, you know, bigger than the actual intended consequence that you're trying to measure, and so it's incredibly difficult. So I think we all understand that particular problem. And yeah, we've come pretty well to the end of this webinar now. So Lisa, you know, thank you very, very much for taking part in this, and I'm sure we'll do more things with you in the future. I hope so anyhow. And you know, Michael, as I said, if you want to talk about doing something from America, we'd be very happy to talk to you about that. And you could even share one with Lisa as well and do a cross-cultural comparison. That could be quite interesting indeed.